London, December 31st, 1600. It's the last night of the year. The city smells like coal smoke and river mud. Somewhere in the narrow streets near the Thames, candles are burning in a meeting room, and 215 merchants are about to sign a piece of paper that will change the entire world. The woman who just approved that paper? Queen Elizabeth I. The document? A royal charter giving a brand new company the exclusive right to trade from the Cape of Good Hope all the way to the Straits of Magellan. That company was called the East India Company. And here's the thing nobody tells you in school. This wasn't a government operation. It wasn't the British Army going overseas with guns blazing. It was a business. A private corporation started by merchants who just wanted to make money from spices. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg. That was the whole idea. At the time, a sack of pepper from Asia could sell in London for 10 times what it cost to buy in the East. The math was simple. Risk was enormous. And a group of English businessmen decided it was worth it. They pooled together £68,373 to fund the first voyage. That's roughly $15 million in today's money. Not from the Queen, not from the government, from private investors betting on the future. The man who led that first fleet was Sir James Lancaster, sailing on a ship called the Red Dragon. He left in 1601, and when he came back, the investors made a profit. Then they went again, and again, and again. Now here's what makes the East India Company unlike anything that had ever existed before. Most companies just trade. The East India Company could do things that would make your jaw drop today. It had the legal right to declare war. It could negotiate treaties with foreign kingdoms. It could mint its own coins. It could raise and command its own military. By the time the company was at its peak, it had a private army of 260,000 soldiers. That's twice the size of the actual British Army at the time. Let that sink in. A private company with shareholders, dividends, and a board of directors ran its own army, bigger than most nations had. How does something like that even happen? Step by step, that's always how. The East India Company didn't start by conquering anyone. It started by asking nicely. Trading posts, warehouses, small agreements with local rulers who thought having these odd English merchants around was convenient, good for business. The EIC was exceptional for two reasons that had never existed together before. First, it was one of the world's earliest joint stock companies, meaning everyday investors could buy a piece of it and share in the profits without being personally responsible if it went bust. Second, it had powers that normally belonged only to governments. A private company with government powers, backed by shareholders who wanted returns. That combination was a machine, and once you wind it up, it doesn't stop easily. George Clifford, the Earl of Cumberland, headed the group of founders. These weren't pirates or soldiers, they were businessmen. Wool merchants, bankers, men in counting houses who talked about profit margins and cargo manifests. Nobody in that room on December 31st was thinking about empire. Nobody was plotting to take over India or carve up the world. They were just thinking about the next voyage, the next profit, one step at a time. That's the part that makes this story both fascinating and haunting. The largest empire in human history didn't start with a grand plan. It started with 215 men signing a charter and hoping their ships didn't sink. The scariest systems in history were rarely built by villains. They were built by ordinary people, taking ordinary steps, each one perfectly reasonable in isolation. Here's a question for you. If a man breaks into a foreign port, burns 30 enemy ships, steals a fortune in gold and silver, and sails home to a hero's welcome, is he a pirate or a naval hero? The answer, it turns out, completely depends on which side you're on. England in the late 1500s had a problem. Spain was the superpower of the world. The Spanish Empire stretched across South America, Central America, the Philippines, and large parts of Europe. Spain controlled the most valuable trade routes on the planet, and England was, by comparison, a small, wet island on the edge of Europe, trying to get in on the action. Queen Elizabeth I didn't have the money or the political capital to declare open war on Spain. But she also wasn't willing to just sit back and watch the Spanish get richer every year. So she found a workaround. She handed out licenses, called letters of marque, to private sea captains. These letters basically said, go attack Spanish ships and ports, keep most of what you steal, and we'll look the other way. Officially, you're not English. Officially, we don't know you. But you're patriotic, you're brave, and we appreciate your contribution. These men were called privateers, and the most famous of them all was a man the Spanish called El Draque, the dragon. His real name was Francis Drake. Drake was born around 1540 in Devon in southwest England. He grew up poor, working on small trading ships from a young age. By his 20s, he was already making raids on Spanish ships in the Caribbean. By his 30s, he was the most wanted man in the Spanish Empire. In December 1577, Drake set sail from Plymouth with 5 ships. His mission, officially, was a trading voyage. His real mission was to raid Spanish ports on the Pacific coast of South America, a route no English ship had ever taken before. To get there, he had to sail through the Strait of Magellan, around the bottom of South America, a passage so dangerous that most sailors considered it suicide. Of his 5 ships, only 1 made it through. But that one ship, the Golden Hind, came out the other side and started working up the Pacific coast, looting Spanish ports that had never seen an English ship in their lives. The Spanish had no defences there. They didn't think they needed any. Nobody attacked from that direction. Drake raided port after port. He captured a Spanish treasure ship called the Cacafuego, and its cargo was staggering. Gold, silver, jewels, enough to make every man on his crew wealthy. Then, instead of going back the way he came, which would mean sailing into Spanish warships who were now furiously looking for him, he just kept going. West, across the Pacific, through the Indian Ocean, around Africa, back to England. On September 26, 1580, Francis Drake sailed back into Plymouth Harbour, becoming the first Englishman, and only the second person in history, to circumnavigate the entire globe. Queen Elizabeth didn't punish him. She came aboard his ship and knighted him on the deck. April 4th, 1581, Sir Francis Drake. The Spanish king was furious. He formally demanded that Elizabeth execute Drake as a pirate. She responded by wearing some of the stolen Spanish jewelry to the ceremony. Drake's story matters not just because he was daring. It matters because of what he represented, a state-sponsored model of wealth building through aggression that nobody wanted to call what it was. England didn't have the money to compete with Spain through honest trade and industry alone, so it created a system where private individuals took all the risk and the Crown took a cut of the rewards while maintaining plausible deniability. In 1587, Drake pulled off one of the boldest raids in naval history. He sailed right into the Spanish port of Cadiz and spent 2 days destroying Spanish warships before anyone could mount an organized defense. He sank or captured over 30 ships. He called it singeing the King of Spain's beard. It delayed the Spanish Armada by a full year. When the Armada finally came in 1588, 130 ships, the most powerful naval force ever assembled, Drake was Vice Admiral of the English fleet. The English ships were smaller but faster and more maneuverable. The Spanish formation broke, storms destroyed the rest. Spain never fully recovered its naval dominance. Drake died in 1596 of dysentery off the coast of Panama. He was buried at sea in a lead coffin. To this day, the Spanish consider him a villain. The English consider him a hero. He was probably both. The empire that followed wasn't built by saints. It was built by people who were very, very good at a particular kind of authorized lawlessness, and who had the backing of a crown that knew exactly what they were doing. Here's a sentence that sounds impossible. A private corporation run by shareholders in London conquered and governed a country of 200 million people. Not a kingdom, not a military alliance, a company with a CEO, with annual reports, with dividends. That company was the East India Company, and the country was India. How does something like that happen? Not all at once, never all at once. The East India Company arrived in India in the early 1600s, wearing the clothes of merchants. They wanted to trade cotton, silk, and spices. They set up small trading posts, called factories, along the Indian coast. They had good manners and useful goods. Local rulers let them stay. For the first 100 years, the company genuinely was, mostly, a trading operation. But India in the 1700s was fracturing. The Mughal Empire that had unified much of the subcontinent was weakening. Regional powers were rising and fighting each other, and into that instability walked the East India Company with money, weapons, and a very specific skill: picking the winning side. The man who made the decisive move was a young company clerk named Robert Clive. Clive was born on September 29, 1725, in Shropshire, England. He was not a military man by training. He was a bookkeeper. But he was aggressive, clever, and spectacularly comfortable with risk. The kind of person who, in another century, might have run a hedge fund. When he arrived in India, he saw opportunity everywhere. The key moment came on June 23, 1757, at a mango grove near a small town called Plassey, beside the Bhagirathi River in Bengal. On one side, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Bengal, the independent ruler of one of the wealthiest provinces in India, with an army of roughly 50,000 soldiers and 50 cannons. On the other side, Robert Clive, with about 3,000 men, around 950 Europeans, and the rest Indian soldiers called sepoys, and 10 cannons. On paper, this should not have been a battle. It should have been a massacre. But Clive had done something Siraj-ud-Dowlah hadn't. He'd bribed the general. Mir Jafar, one of Siraj's most senior commanders, had been secretly promised the throne of Bengal in exchange for switching sides at the critical moment. When the battle started, Mir Jafar simply didn't advance. His troops stood still. The rest of Siraj's army fell into confusion. Then the monsoon rains came. They soaked the gunpowder of the Bengal artillery. Siraj's cannons went silent. Clive's cannons, which he'd had the foresight to cover with tarps, still worked. The battle lasted barely a few hours. Siraj's massive army collapsed and fled. He was captured shortly after and assassinated. Mir Jafar became Nawab of Bengal, and Robert Clive walked away with £234,000 in personal payment, roughly $35 million today, plus an annual income from Bengal land that made him one of the wealthiest men in England. The East India Company gained effective control of Bengal, one of the most productive and densely populated regions on Earth. From there, the corporate conquest of India accelerated over the next century. By the mid-1800s, the East India Company controlled more territory than any empire in the world except Britain itself. Its private army numbered 250,000 soldiers. Its decisions shaped the lives of hundreds of millions of people. In 1858, after a major Indian uprising, the British government finally decided this was too much. Parliament passed a law dissolving the company's governing powers. The British Crown took direct control of India. The era of the British Raj had begun. The East India Company was formally dissolved in 1874, but the template it created, a private organization using economic leverage, local alliances and military force to establish control, would shape empire building for the next 2 centuries. The most powerful weapon in history isn't a cannon. It's a contract that puts someone else in charge of enforcing your interests. Think about the sugar in your coffee, or the cotton in the shirt you're wearing right now. Commodities so ordinary, so everyday, that you never think about where they actually came from, how they got here, what the real cost was, because the real cost wasn't measured in money. The British Empire in the 17th, 18th and early 19th centuries ran on a system historians call the triangular trade, and it is one of the most coldly efficient and deeply horrifying economic machines in human history. Here's how it worked. Ships left England from ports like Liverpool, Bristol and London, loaded with manufactured goods, guns, cloth, metal tools, industrial products. They sailed south and east to the West African coast. There, those goods were exchanged for human beings, people who had been captured by local slave traders or taken in raids and sold on the coast. The enslaved Africans were packed into the ships for the crossing of the Atlantic. Historians call this passage the Middle Passage. People were chained, lying flat, in spaces barely larger than coffins, stacked in rows, in conditions that were almost inconceivably brutal. Disease spread rapidly: dysentery, typhoid, smallpox. Death rates in the early years of the trade were 15 to 20%. For every ship that carried 600 people, roughly 90 to 120 would die before reaching land. Those who survived arrived in the Caribbean or the American colonies. They were sold at auction, publicly, in the open air, to work on plantations. From those plantations came sugar, tobacco, cotton. These goods were loaded back onto ships and sailed to Britain, where they were sold at enormous profit. The cycle ran continuously. Every round trip made money, and every profit was built on suffering that most of the buyers and sellers in London never had to look at directly. The first Englishman to run this system as a large-scale commercial operation was John Hawkins. In 1562, he sailed with 3 ships to the West African coast, captured around 300 people, and sold them in Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. The profit was huge. Queen Elizabeth herself was pleased enough to invest personally in his second voyage. From that point, the trade only grew. The city that dominated it more than any other was Liverpool. Between 1793 and 1807, Liverpool controlled 84.7% of all British slave trade voyages. The docks were full, the merchants were wealthy, and the accounting officers worked through the night. For these men, the trade wasn't a moral question, it was a spreadsheet. In total, British ships transported somewhere between 3.1 and 3.5 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic between 1640 and 1807. When you combine all nations, the total number of people taken from Africa across the Atlantic is estimated at 12 to 12.5 million people. 12.5 million people. The beautiful buildings you can still see in Bristol and Liverpool today, the grand townhouses, the bridges, the civic institutions, were largely financed by this trade, directly or indirectly. In 1807, under intense pressure from abolitionists like William Wilberforce, Parliament finally passed the Slave Trade Act, banning the trade across the British Empire. Some historians argue it happened partly because the profitability of Caribbean slave labour was declining as industrialisation in England made it relatively less competitive. In 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act went further, officially ending slavery in most of the British Empire, taking effect August 1, 1834. The British government paid £20 million in compensation, not to the enslaved people, not to the families of those who had died, to the slave owners for the loss of their property. That £20 million was equivalent to about 40% of the entire British government budget that year. The government had to borrow to pay it. And here's a detail so extraordinary it barely seems real. That debt was only fully paid off in 2015. Which means British taxpayers alive today were still, until recently, paying off the debt incurred by compensating slave owners in 1833. The people who were actually enslaved received nothing on the day of abolition. History often gets told as a story about ideas, freedom, progress, civilization. But underneath every big idea is an economic engine. And for a long time, the engine of the British Empire ran on something it has never fully reckoned with. There's a song British schoolchildren used to sing, and in some places still do. Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves. Britons never, never, never shall be slaves. It's catchy, it's stirring, and it raises an interesting question. How exactly did an island nation of a few million people come to dominate the oceans of the entire world? The answer is not destiny, it's not divine favour, it's not some special quality of the English character. It's engineering, discipline, and a willingness to learn from getting beaten. England's navy in the early 1500s was not impressive. It was outclassed by the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the Dutch. But the English had a particular quality that more powerful nations often lack. They paid close attention to what was working and what wasn't, and they changed. The first major shift came in naval tactics. Traditional warfare at sea involved sailing close to the enemy, throwing grappling hooks, and fighting hand-to-hand on the decks, essentially a land battle on water. The Spanish were very good at this. They had bigger ships, more soldiers, and more experience. The English decided to play a different game. Instead of getting close, English ships would stand off at distance and use their cannons. They developed longer-range guns and, critically, trained their gunners to reload and fire faster than anyone else. A ship that could fire 3 rounds for every 2 of the enemy had a massive advantage without ever having to get close enough to be boarded. This tactical shift didn't happen because of one genius strategist. It happened through years of experience, the pressure of competition, and the hard lessons learned in fights against the Spanish in the Caribbean. The Spanish Armada of 1588 was the proof of concept. The Armada carried 130 ships, the largest fleet ever assembled at that point in history. The Spanish plan was to escort an army from the Netherlands to England and overthrow Elizabeth. The English fleet had fewer ships and lighter artillery, but they were faster, more maneuverable, and devastatingly accurate at range. The battle off the English coast lasted days. The English never let the Spanish get close enough to board. They peppered the Spanish formation from a distance, broke the fleet apart, and then helped nature finish the job. A powerful storm drove the remaining Spanish ships around the north of Scotland and Ireland, wrecking dozens of them. Spain didn't recover from that blow for decades. But the English Navy's real transformation came later, in the mid-17th century, when it stopped being an improvised collection of merchant ships the government borrowed in emergencies and became a permanent, professional institution. Dedicated naval dockyards were built at Portsmouth and Chatham, capable of constructing and maintaining warships year-round. A hierarchy of officers was established, with career paths and professional expectations. The rank of admiral became a full-time position, not something handed to an aristocrat who happened to own ships. And perhaps most importantly, England built supply bases all around the globe. Gibraltar, controlling the entrance to the Mediterranean. Cape Town, the gateway between the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. Singapore, the choke point of Southeast Asian trade. Aden, the mouth of the Red Sea. These weren't just military bases, they were refueling stops, repair yards, intelligence posts and resupply points. Any British warship anywhere in the world was never more than a few weeks' sail from a friendly port. Any other nation's navy operating in those same waters was on its own. The result was something historians call Pax Britannica, the British peace, which lasted roughly from 1815, after Napoleon's defeat, to 1897. For 80 years, the British Navy was so dominant that no major naval power dared challenge it directly. International trade flowed through sea lanes that Britain effectively controlled. If you wanted to trade with Asia, you moved through the Indian Ocean, British territory. If you wanted to trade with the Americas, you crossed the Atlantic, waters British ships patrolled constantly. If you wanted to ship goods through the Mediterranean, you passed Gibraltar, a British fortress. The empire didn't need to occupy every country to profit from every country. It just needed to control the roads. No one builds power overnight. The Royal Navy that ruled the waves in 1850 was the product of 200 years of investment, failure, learning, and reinvestment. It was the result of generation after generation of shipwrights, navigators, admirals, and ordinary sailors doing their jobs slightly better than the competition. Power that lasts is never accidental. In 1800, Manchester had about 80,000 people. By 1850, it had 330,000. The population quadrupled in 50 years, not because of some unusually high birth rate, not because of immigration from foreign countries, because of a sound, a specific, relentless, never-stopping sound that echoed through the city's factories every hour of every day. The sound of the steam engine. If you walked into Manchester in the middle of the 19th century, the sky above the city was grey. Not the grey of clouds, the grey of smoke from thousands of factory chimneys that never stopped burning. The smell of coal and machine oil was part of the air. The clang of metal and the hiss of steam ran 24 hours a day. And along the narrow streets full of workers, 10-year-old boys were leaving home before dawn to work in mills where they wouldn't see sunlight again until dark. Manchester was simultaneously a miracle and a nightmare. Before we understand how the Industrial Revolution transformed the British Empire, we need to ask, why did it happen in England specifically? Not in France, not in China, not in India. England, in the late 1600s and early 1700s, had a very particular combination of conditions. Huge reserves of coal and iron located close to rivers and coastlines, easy to transport, low cost. A legal system that protected property rights and contracts, so inventors and business people were willing to invest in new things. Colonial markets already developed over hundreds of years, ready to absorb whatever England could produce. And a culture that respected commerce and innovation, while the aristocracies of most of Europe still considered trade beneath their dignity. When those conditions were in place, all it needed was a spark. That spark had a name, the steam engine. In 1712, a man named Thomas Newcomen built the first practical steam-powered machine. It used steam to push a piston up and down, powerful enough to pump water out of flooded coal mines. It was fuel-hungry and inefficient, but it did something human and animal muscle couldn't. It worked continuously, day and night, without rest. The man who transformed the steam engine from a mine pump into the heart of the Industrial Revolution was James Watt. Watt was an instrument maker at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. He was asked to repair a Newcomen engine and noticed, while working on it, that the machine was wasting an enormous amount of energy in every cycle, because it had to cool and reheat the same cylinder over and over. He spent years solving that problem. In 1769, he patented improvements that dramatically increased efficiency by adding a separate condensing chamber. The engine could now run faster and more consistently, using far less fuel. But the patent that changed everything came in 1777, when Watt figured out how to convert the up and down motion of a piston into rotation. Suddenly, the steam engine wasn't just a pump. It could power wheels, it could power looms, it could power any machine that needed turning. From that day, everything changed. Cotton mills in Lancashire started replacing human and animal power with steam engines. One machine could do the work of dozens of workers, and it could run for 24 hours without getting tired. Britain's cotton output multiplied many times over in a short period. The price of cotton cloth dropped until ordinary people all over the world could afford to buy it. Britain became the workshop of the world. By 1800, there were more than 2,500 steam engines installed in England alone, and the number kept growing every year. But steam engines needed coal, and coal needed transportation. In 1825, the world's first commercial passenger steam railway opened in England, connecting Stockton and Darlington in the northeast. The speed it could travel was astonishing to people at the time. Humans who had spent their entire lives traveling by horse and ship were experiencing a velocity no one in history had ever felt. The railway network spread outward with staggering speed, like a spider's web thrown across the country. By 1870, England had more than 24,000 kilometres of track, connecting every city, every mine, every port. Coal from Welsh mines reached factories in Manchester within hours. Finished cloth from Lancashire mills reached the port at Liverpool the same day. The railways also changed what time and distance meant. Cities that once took 2 days to travel between became 2 hours apart. For the first time in history, ordinary people could move around the country at a cost they could afford. Every revolution fed the next. Steam-powered industry. Industry needed coal. Railways moved coal. Railways opened new markets. New markets needed more industry. But the revolution didn't distribute its benefits equally. Factory cities were living nightmares. Workers laboured 12 to 16 hours a day in buildings with no ventilation, filled with dust and chemical fumes. Chronic lung disease was routine for miners and mill workers. Children as young as 5 or 6 crawled through coal mine tunnels too narrow for adults, earning wages barely enough to survive on. Friedrich Engels, whose father owned a Manchester factory, walked through the working-class districts of the city in 1843 and recorded what he found. Rooms where a dozen people slept, streets where sewage collected in open gutters, children who looked decades older than their age. All of it within a short walk of the warehouses where their employers were getting very rich. While factory owners built grand houses in the countryside, workers lived in crowded districts with no clean water and regular outbreaks of cholera. And this inequality wasn't just happening inside England. When Britain could produce goods cheaper and faster than any country on earth, local industries everywhere else collapsed. Cheap cotton from Manchester flooded into India, destroying the handloom. Weaving industry that had sustained millions of Bengali families for centuries. Weavers who had once produced the finest cloth in the world found they couldn't compete with machines that worked 10 times faster than a human. Economists call this creative destruction. New technology destroys the old to create the new. But in this case, what was being destroyed was in India, and what was being created was in England. At its peak, in the mid-19th century, a country smaller than many others produced over 50% of the world's steel, more cotton cloth than every other country combined, and more locomotives and steamships than the rest of the world put together. In 1851, Britain threw itself a party called the Great Exhibition in London, a World's Fair held inside a magnificent glass structure called the Crystal Palace. Nations from around the world were invited to display their goods. Britain displayed its machines. It was a declaration to the world: we are the factory. You are the customers. The steam engine that James Watt improved in a small laboratory in Glasgow eventually became the most powerful weapon the Empire ever had. More powerful than any warship, more powerful than any army, more powerful than any treaty. Because the greatest weapon in history isn't one that kills people, It's one that makes everyone else depend on you. Let me ask you something. Imagine you want to invade someone else's land, take their resources, and force them to live under your control for generations. How do you make yourself feel good about that? Not just okay, not just able to live with it, actually proud, ready to tell your children that you were the hero. The answer the British Empire found was breathtakingly simple and breathtakingly effective. You tell yourself you're not stealing, you're helping. In 1899, a British poet named Rudyard Kipling published a poem called The White Man's Burden. It called on Western nations to go and govern what he called backward peoples, to bring them civilization, order, and progress. He described the colonized peoples as half devil and half child, needing adult guidance. And he described the act of colonial rule as a duty, not a privilege. What's striking about the poem is that it even described the burden as exhausting and thankless, positioning the rulers as martyrs rather than beneficiaries. The language framed the people doing the exploiting as the ones making the sacrifice. That is masterful storytelling. When you can convince yourself that you're the victim of your own dominance, there's nothing you can't justify. The poem was reprinted in newspapers, read in Parliament, and taught in schools. It became the mental framework that millions of British people used to explain to themselves why what their empire was doing was right and good. But this kind of thinking didn't spring from nowhere. It was built up over the 18th and 19th centuries through three channels: bad science, religion, and education, all working together. Charles Darwin published his theory of evolution in 1859. It was a genuine scientific breakthrough about how species change over time through natural selection. But within years, a group of thinkers had stripped it of its scientific context and applied it to human societies in ways Darwin never intended. They called it social Darwinism. The argument was simple and deeply wrong. Human races have a natural hierarchy, and the ones who have achieved dominance have proven their superiority. Therefore, governing the less powerful is natural, even beneficial. Scientists measured skull shapes and brain sizes and published studies proving European racial superiority. Anthropologists ranked the world's peoples from primitive to civilized, with white Europeans conveniently at the top. These studies were published in academic journals, cited in Parliament, and used to justify policies that affected hundreds of millions of people. We now know they were scientifically flawed in both methodology and interpretation, but at the time they were presented as settled facts. Bad science provided the logical framework, religion filled in the rest. Christian missionaries traveled with armies and merchants everywhere the empire expanded. They built schools and hospitals, and some of the help they provided was genuine. But the schools also taught colonized peoples to be ashamed of their own languages and cultures, to see themselves as inferior, and to believe that advancement meant becoming as Western as possible. A man who went to a missionary school, wore English clothes, spoke English fluently, and had abandoned his mother tongue, was held up as a success story. In India, a British educational administrator named Thomas Macaulay wrote a memo to the government in 1835 calling for the creation of a local elite who would be Indian in blood and colour, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. The idea was to build a class of local administrators who would help run the empire on behalf of Britain, and who believed genuinely that what they were doing was progress. That memo was implemented. It created cultural fractures that can still be seen in many societies today. Here's why all of this matters beyond the history. These weren't cynical lies told by people who knew they were lying. The British officer who genuinely believed he was bringing civilization to India wasn't acting, he believed it. The missionary who felt she was saving souls wasn't performing, she felt she was doing good. The politician who voted for colonial policies wasn't secretly evil, he thought he was advancing human progress. The framework was so complete, so embedded in every institution, from school to church to newspaper, that it was almost impossible to see from the inside. Then came the Berlin Conference. In November 1884, representatives from 14 European nations and the United States gathered in Berlin, hosted by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. Not a single African representative was in the room. For 3 months, they sat around maps of Africa and drew lines. The Berlin Conference, which ended in February 1885, divided the entire continent of Africa among European powers. The lines they drew were often perfectly straight because they were drawn by men with rulers and pencils who had never been to the places they were dividing. Those lines cut through existing kingdoms, separated communities that had lived together for centuries, and threw together groups who had been rivals or enemies. They were drawn by men who had almost no knowledge of the cultures, languages, or histories of the regions they were carving up. And throughout the conference, the delegates spoke of Africa as if it were an empty space waiting to receive civilization. Despite the fact that the continent had hosted sophisticated kingdoms, complex trade networks, and rich philosophical traditions for thousands of years before anyone in that room had been born. The ethnic conflicts across Africa that dominate international news today, wars that seem impossible to end, borders that make no geographic or cultural sense, have their roots in 3 months of meetings in Berlin in 1884 and 1885. Then there was the Middle East. In 1916, in the middle of World War I, British diplomat Mark Sykes and French diplomat François-Georges Picot sat down and divided the Middle East between their two countries. They knew almost nothing about the ethnic, religious, and historical realities of the region they were splitting. Arab fighters had been fighting alongside the British to defeat the Ottoman Empire, promised independence after the war. What they didn't know was that at the same time, Britain was secretly giving away their lands to France. Those warriors crossed deserts, captured city after city, believing every drop of blood they shed was building a free and independent nation. When the war ended, the map drawn in a London office was imposed. The dream they had fought for was never honoured. The conflict still burning in the Middle East today, the borders that cut across communities, the divisions that seem impossible to heal, have their roots in a secret agreement made in 1916 by 2 men with a map and no accountability to the people they were dividing. What's notable about both the Berlin Conference and the Sykes-Picot Agreement is that both were done in the name of civilization and progress. The people who drew those lines didn't think they were doing anything wrong. They thought they were bringing order to chaos, development to backwardness, light to darkness. And that's the most unsettling lesson of all. The most dangerous empires in history aren't the ones that are openly cruel. They're the ones that are politely, sincerely, genuinely convinced they're doing good. Because a person who knows they're doing wrong can be stopped by their own conscience. But a person who is absolutely certain they're doing right, there's nothing that stops them at all. The sun never sets on the British Empire. That wasn't just a boast. For almost 100 years, it was a geographical fact. When your territory is spread across every continent on Earth, there's no moment in the 24-hour cycle when all of it is dark at the same time. At its peak, around 1920, the British Empire governed territory covering more than a quarter of the Earth's land surface. Over a quarter of the world's entire human population lived under its rule. No empire in history had ever achieved anything close to it. Not Rome, not the Mongols, not the Persians. And then, in less than 60 years from that peak, almost all of it was gone. In 1947, India gained independence. That was the clearest signal that the greatest empire in human history was unraveling. After that, the colonies came back one by one. Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, Pacific, all reclaiming what had always been theirs, piece by piece, country by country. How does something that powerful collapse that quickly? The simple answer is 2 world wars, the first from 1914 to 1918, the second from 1939 to 1945. Together they drained Britain of blood, money, and the moral authority to keep telling the rest of the world what to do. Britain went from being the world's creditor, the country that lent money to everyone, to one of the world's largest debtors. The armies that had maintained control in distant territories had to come home. The budget that had funded the Royal Navy's global presence simply didn't exist anymore. But there's a deeper answer that's more interesting. Soldiers from India, Africa, and the Caribbean fought alongside Britain in both world wars. They crossed oceans to defend the freedom of Europe. They saw Paris and London. They experienced a world larger than the one they'd been allowed to inhabit. And when they came home, a question followed them that couldn't be unasked. If freedom is worth dying for, why don't we have it? There was no good answer. And beyond that, the British Empire was ultimately defeated by the ideas it had itself planted. Britain taught colonized peoples to read. It taught them to write. It taught them logic and philosophy and political theory. And the educated elites of the colonies read John Locke and John Stuart Mill, English philosophers who had written extensively about the universal rights of human beings, and asked the inevitable question: if liberty is the birthright of all humanity, as your own philosophers say, then why do you deny it to us? There was no answer to that either. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi in India, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, and Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana were all educated in London. They learned law and philosophy and political organizing from British institutions, and then they used that knowledge to dismantle the empire that had taught them. Gandhi's particular genius was to fight the empire with a weapon it had no answer for. The empire was skilled at responding to violence with violence. But what do you do when your opponents simply sit down, refuse to move, and accept whatever comes? Every time British authorities responded with force against peaceful protesters, the world watched. The empire's moral justification that it was there to help fell apart in public, in real time, with cameras running. The collapse of empire, seen this way, wasn't defeat from outside. It was the inevitable implosion of a system that claimed to believe in freedom while systematically denying it, a contradiction that could only be maintained for so long before it tore itself apart. When the empire finally ended, what did it leave behind? That question is still argued loudly today. Some point to what they call the gifts of empire, the railway network still running across India, the legal systems many former colonies still use, the English language that became the world's common tongue, the educational institutions that continue to train leaders across the developing world. Others push back. If the empire hadn't been there, wouldn't India have built its own railways? Without systematic industrial suppression, how much further along would these countries be today? And the railways Britain built, were they built for Indian benefit or to move raw materials from inland resources to export ports? Some economists have tried to calculate it. India's share of global economic output was roughly 25% in 1700. By independence in 1947, it had fallen to about 4%. The wealth that flowed from India to Britain during that period, in raw materials, in trade profits, in extracted value, is staggering to even estimate. There's no parallel universe where you can see what would have happened without colonialism. History doesn't give you counterfactuals. You can't know for certain. And that uncertainty is real. But here's what you can ask, right now, today. Is the empire really over? The form has changed. Nobody plants a flag anymore and declares a colony. But the mechanisms that allowed wealthy nations to extract value from poorer ones, those are still very much operational, just wearing different clothes. Multinational corporations enter developing nations promising investment and jobs, the same promise the East India Company once made, with similarly complicated fine print about who really benefits in the long run. International financial institutions sometimes attach conditions to loans that force poorer nations to open their markets and reduce protections for local industries. Not entirely unlike how Britain once required India to accept cheap Manchester cotton at low tariffs while taxing Indian exports heavily. And the narrative that developed nations are helping underdeveloped ones, that framework is still in wide use. The label has changed from the white man's burden to development aid. But the structure of the relationship, the one who knows better, the one who needs guidance, looks familiar. None of this means every foreign investment is exploitation, or that every international institution is the East India Company in disguise. Reality is more complicated than that, and genuine help and genuine harm are always mixed together in any era. But knowing the history of the British Empire gives you a sharper set of questions to bring to any of it. Who actually benefits from this arrangement over time? Whose story is being told, and who's telling it? Between the words and the actions, which one is telling the truth? The British Empire wasn't a story of obvious evil. It was a story of ordinary people doing ordinary things. Some greedy, some afraid, some ambitious, some genuinely well-intentioned, inside a system that produced extraordinary harm at a scale that still shapes the world we live in. The merchant in London in 1600, who invested in the East India Company, couldn't have imagined that his small bet on a spice trade would eventually become the largest empire in human history. The sailor who fought for the Queen had no idea he was part of a machine that would be studied and argued about 4 centuries later. Everyone was living in the world as they understood it from the inside. History's lesson isn't about who was good or evil. It's about how systems that seem perfectly reasonable to the people inside them can produce consequences nobody intended and everybody contributed to. The question that doesn't go away is, if we'd been born then, in that place, in that situation, who would we have been? What would we have done? There's no comfortable answer to that, but that's what history is for. Not to make us feel good about the past, but to make us think harder about the present. The black box is closed, but the signal never stops. Keep listening. Keep asking questions.